Okay. Welcome everyone. And tonight we're going to pick up from where we left off probably about a year ago, and talk about some of the parables, in particular the work of our Lord, our Father in heaven, and the way he works with us, and his Son, our Lord, that we remembered this morning, and the way that he works with us by way of parable. And parable, as we see, is both in Old Testament and New Testament, and we're going to deal particularly, we have dealt with the clay. Remember last time we talked about the potter and the clay. This time we're going to move on from there into the imagery of the vine and the vineyard and the husbandman and the labourers, and consider sort of the same sort of theme, that is, God works with us and how God works with us and how he perseveres with us, but this time a little bit more too in the way that we interact with the work that the Father is trying to achieve. Unlike the clay vessel, which is inanimate, isn't it? It's clay, and God did all the work and the shaping, and remember, he made a vessel that he considered fit for purpose, that was fit for his purpose. And every now and again the clay would misbehave, wouldn't it? It marred in his hands, as I said. In other words, it didn't come to the shape that the potter was trying to make, but he persevered with it until he finished up with a vessel fit for purpose, which the Apostle Paul picked up, you might recall, and he talked about in a large house there are many vessels. Some of them are gold, silver, brass, wood, stone, clay, whatever. They may seem to have different value to us, but the point that what Paul is making is that each vessel was fit for purpose. You don't have a gold vessel, unless you're super rich, and put a pot plant in it. You have a pot plant vessel. You might have just a clay vessel, or today you have a plastic one, but you'd have a clay vessel in those days. And in that you'd put the seed and you would grow your plant. You wouldn't have it in a basin that you use for washing, would you? And that's the point, that we are all different vessels fit for a purpose, made for purpose by God. And it doesn't matter if to the external eye you're gold, silver, bronze, clay, plastic, whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is that you are a vessel which God has appointed for a particular purpose and made fit for purpose. And the parables we're going to consider now as we go on sort of take that idea of us as vessels, as part of his workmanship in both a community and as an individual. And it comes into the imagery of a vineyard. The point there on the screen, remember, is that scriptural parables have intent, context, and application. All of them are of that structure. And we need to be careful when we try and use technology. Okay, it's not going to work with my on my screen. Steve? Okay, there we go. Hit the right button, it makes a world of difference. And sorry if I seem a little bit uncomfortable. I found out actually in the last couple of weeks that I'm actually not spineless. I've got a spine. It's given me a bit of curry. Okay, what's the intent of a parable? Well, we've seen that it could be to draw attention to personal failure. It could be to draw attention to prejudice and misconception, and we saw some of that this morning in the exhort, didn't we? Could be to illustrate characteristics of God and Jesus, and that was very powerfully made this morning, I think. It wasn't about the characteristic of Jesus particularly in dealing with that situation with Simon. And it could be designed to illustrate moral lessons. There could be a variety of reasons and intent behind a parable. But there is one common theme, and I just want to keep pushing that point, that we get that clearly, if nothing else. They are designed to evoke a personal response. That's what they are all about, a personal response. Not, oh, well, that applies to somebody else, that's not relevant to me. It is a personal response. Context. Didn't come up with context, did it? Okay, let's just play with this. Nope. Eh? Other way?
It's not there now. There it is.
Oh, it's going to be interesting. I can see him, that's fine. Okay, in the context, we look at the author of a parable. It's relevant. Who is the author? No. Okay, good. This is a little frustrating, eh? I'll nod my head every time I want to hit, or I'll push button, whatever. Context. The author of the parable is quite important. And like, for example, here in Isaiah, the author is God. It's the Father. He gives a parable about his vineyard. The audience receiving the parable is also important because, for example, there's this parable that we will consider probably in the next class about a fig tree planted in a vineyard. And to us, we'd probably think, what on earth is a fig tree doing in a vineyard? I mean, you have like grow almonds or grow figs or grow that, and you grow vines and whatever. Why have a fig? Well, it was a common thing in Israel. In actual fact, under the law, one of the laws of Moses says what you could grow, what fruits and that you could mix. And the rabbis did a whole interpretation of it. And one of the things was you could have a fig tree in a vineyard. And you do that for all sorts of reasons. One, because you tend to look after the vineyard and therefore the fig tree would also be fruitful and benefit by the care given to the vineyard. But also it would provide shade for the workers in the vineyard. And it was a very common thing in the Middle East that there was a fig tree in a vineyard or fig trees along the side of the vineyard. And so when Jesus spoke about a fig tree in the vineyard, it would have resonated with oh yeah, sure, they'd see it every day. And they could relate to what Jesus was talking about, whereas we would probably think that's a bit odd. Or the context could be very specific. Like we will consider, for example, the wicked husbandman, the husbandman which rejected the messengers which the owner sent and eventually killed his son. And that was very specific, and the people got the point. In that parable, the elders realised that he was talking about them, and it was very specific. Does it apply to us, though? Well, we need to think about it. And so sometimes with the parables, you think about the principle of what's happening as opposed to the fact that it was specific for those people. And sometimes it's just timeless, and that's the case with the vine. When he addressed the disciples in that whole section of John, about John 11, right through the end of John, he was talking in a timeless sense and included us in the words which he had. Okay, I hit the button. And the application of the parable could be either immediate, personal, or timeless, as we've said. And we need to think about that. But as I say, one thing is certain. They're designed to evoke a personal response. And that response might be different for each of us, depending on what our circumstances are. We might read it in a totally different way because it is or isn't applicable to us at that point in time. It's not a question of being right and wrong, or one interpretation, or one typology, or one of anything. They were designed, particularly by Jesus, to be applicable to you personally. How did you read that? How did you see yourself in the parable then? And another thing about parables is there needs to be a balancing of detail with principle. It's a very important thing. Too fine an interpretation of each element of a parable can lead us to inaccurate conclusions. And yet too little attention to detail, we might dismiss them just as moral lessons, as stories with a hidden meaning, however you want to express it. No, there needs to be a balance in the way that we look at these. Look, an example of a parable that leads to inaccurate conclusion, if you really look at the detail, is the parable of the forgiving creditor. The debtor came to him and begged. I mean, he wasn't honest in his dealings, but he came to him and begged forgiveness, and I'll pay. And what did the creditor? He said, well, I'll forgive you. Now, he went out then, the parable says, and he grabbed hold of a fellow servant round the neck and grabbed him and threw him into jail because he owned, maybe 1/10 of what he did. And when the servants came and told the master about what happened, what did the master do? Well, he unforgave him. Now, anyone who simply says, oh, well, there's an example of God and forgiveness and whatever, well, I wouldn't want that. Do we want God to unforgive us when we go out and treat our fellows differently? No. See, if you sort of hone in and say, well, it must be, God must be this in the parable, and this must be this, and this must be this, be careful. Because you can come to some really strange conclusions. Okay. Now, what we're going to look at now is husbandry and viticulture. That is, ownership and general care of the land, and then in particular, looking after the vine. And here's the parable in Isaiah chapter 5. God is the viticulturist, and there's 4 parables that we're not going to look at all tonight, but we will over 2 nights. God is the viticulturist, Israel is the vineyard. Pretty straightforward. In Matthew 21, we've got a parable by Jesus that draws on this in one particular way. It's God is the owner and the labourers are the husbandmen. And then there are 2 other parables. In Luke chapter 13, God is the owner, and within that vineyard there is an individual fig tree that the owner was looking for to bring forth fruit. It's in the fig tree. That's an important little detail. But in this instance, I think Jesus is the viticulturalist. Fairly simple to say that because he begs the owner to give him another year to work on the fig tree and to work with it and try and get it to produce fruit. Interestingly, we don't know the outcome. And in John chapter 15, God is the husbandman. Jesus is this time the vine. So we've sort of, our focus has gone from a vineyard down to a fig tree in a vineyard, and now down to the vine in the vineyard, and Jesus' followers are the branches. So, and all these relate back to the old prophecies, the old parables in Isaiah, and also the fig tree in Jeremiah. But it's almost as if the parables are focusing down in detail until we get to the very essence of the vine, and Jesus says it quite plainly, the disciples that's us, are the branches. And then there's a whole lot of symbology in that parable about the relationship between God, Jesus, and the branches. So now a couple of maybe interesting bits. In the Old Testament, there's 2 parables, as I said. One here in Isaiah chapter 5, the vineyard, and the vineyard fairly clearly, and it's self-explanatory in the parable itself, is equivalent to the nation. And then in Jeremiah 24, we have the parable of the good and the bad, of the naughty figs, and clearly that's the individuals, because the parable self-explains itself as it is. So what becomes one parable in the New Testament by Jesus is 2 parables, one in Isaiah and one in Jeremiah. So Jesus gives the same as Isaiah 5, the national judgment, And then he gives a thing about individual judgment in Luke 13, which is the fig tree within the vineyard. And that, I'm suggesting, is about individual judgment but provision for redemption, because the viticulturist tries to work with that fig tree for another year. And in John 15, we have individual judgment, but it's much closer association with the life provider. In other words, it says quite clearly we're drawing our sustenance from the vine, from Christ himself as the provider. We are a branch. So that's a general overview of where we're going and what's happening. So let's have a look at Isaiah chapter 5. What's the intent? What's the context? What's the application? Well, the intent is in actual fact for there to be a judgment. Verse 3, "And know, inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge, I pray you, betwixt me and my vineyard." And you see what the parable is doing here is it's making the people think about the situation themselves. Now, back in Isaiah chapter 1, if you come back to Isaiah chapter 1, the same sort of argument is being put by God to the people. But he says to them, "Come, let us reason together." No, I want to talk to you about this situation. Why should you, verse 5, be stricken anymore? Why will you revolt? And why this and why that? And why your behaviour? Your country's desolate. Hear the words of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom and you people of God, you people of Gomorrah. And it's quite stern and it's quite expressive in its language. And he says, well, am I right or am I wrong? And he reasons with them to try and get them to see what's happening. They didn't see it. They didn't understand it in the sense that they were being preached to, and nothing wrong with that. But the idea in chapter 5 that God tries is to appeal to them, is to present them with this, that they might listen and be able to relate to what's happening by imagery. In actual fact, in chapter 5, it's a song. Although it's a parable, it is a song. But the people, having turned their back on God's moral code, that's the context, what's going to happen? Well, both in chapter 1 and here in chapter 5 with the parable, the husband's not going to practice his craft, and he's even going to withhold his life-giving rain. And people could picture that. And your picture's worth 1,000 words. It's probably 2,000 of my words. But it's worth something because you can think about it, you get the imagery, and you can say, I see what he's saying. What is he saying? Well, he says, I have a vineyard, but not anywhere. Not just down the road, up on a bend in the River Murray or something. I planted a vineyard in a very fruitful hill. I already knew it produced fruit. I didn't create this vineyard in a barren place. No, I created this vineyard in a fruitful place. So I had a reasonable expectation that it would bear fruit. Well, it did bear fruit. But what sort of fruit did it bear? Well, after I'd done everything for it, including the tower and fenced it and looked after it and protected it, it brought forth sour grapes or wild grapes. The sugar content was no good. In other words, it didn't actually draw on the goodness of the earth that it was planted in to produce grapes which had the right sugar content. That's the secret of grape growing and producing wine, isn't it? It's all about sugar content. It's all about that fruit coming to its fullness and the right balance of sugar, and then go through with the process of fermentation and make the wine. Well, this one was bitter, or what was the word, Daniel, in your... Sour. Not enough sugar. Wasn't sweet fruit. And so there were consequences to that. Why wasn't it sweet fruit? Well, I put the whole thing up there just so you could see it. And why did Jesus draw on this? Because this parable, where are we? It should be a black screen with scales on it. That's it. Thanks, Dan. So, if we actually look at the beginning of this parable, it's a song for my beloved. It's no wonder Jesus drew on this imagery 3 times, because when he read from Isaiah the prophet, he would have read a parable which God gave for him. And he took this and he applied it. And he applied it in his own parables. And a song is easy to remember, isn't it? Well, it's easier to remember than the whole text. So although the argument is the same in Isaiah 1 as it is here in Isaiah 5, do you remember anything that you read in Isaiah 1? Oh, you don't have to answer that. Just think about it. We read a couple of verses. We read a couple of verses about what the issues were. Do you remember? Or do you remember the imagery here of chapter 5? I give it to you that as a song and as a parable, you're more likely to remember and to be able to think about the issues. And what were the issues? Well, it says there at the end, at verse 7. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah his pleasant plant. So there's no question about interpretation. And I will also command the clouds that they give no rain. And he looked for judgment, but behold oppression, and for righteousness, but behold a cry. Now, that is not the best sort of interpretation. The Hebrew, the Hebrew Bible itself says he looked for justice, but he saw injustice. And so you have this picture now of like a balance, of a scale, and that's why the scales are there in the background. He looked for equity, but he saw inequity. So they were the two fruits that God would say, as the owner of the vineyard, that he's looking for. Sweet fruit, justice and equity. And he didn't see that in the people. Well, one other thing before you flick off that slide. Just want you to bear that picture in mind. Would you say the scales in the background are balanced? Well, if I said to you they are jeweller's scales, right? What would be the normal representation of a jeweller's scale? Well, you'd see the traditional cross piece, but you would see the two holders would be level, wouldn't they? So that you'd say they were equal, they were balanced scales. Yeah. Not here with justice and equity. Because the two don't balance for God. It's not A and B, you've done this, you get that. It's not like that. in a sense, God's scales are very imbalanced. Mercy supersedes by a long way judgment. Okay, let's have a look at justice and equity. Let's just go behind this concept, why God is looking for this justice and mercy. Well, thanks, Dan. Scriptural justice mirrors God's righteousness and emphasises the characteristics of mercy and compassion, not simply righteousness in the sense of rightness. See, if I was looking at balanced scales, I've got to balance up something that's gone wrong and something which is right. Well, that's not the way actually God administers justice, because that rightness is tempered with mercy and compassion. Come across to Psalm 85. Let's just see this characteristic of what God is looking for. Psalm 85 and at verse, let's pick up verse 8. Or verse 7 really. Show us thy mercy, O Lord, and grant us thy salvation. I will hear what God the Lord will speak, for he will speak peace to his people and to his saints, and let them not turn again to folly. Surely his salvation is nigh them that fear him, that glory may dwell in our land. And mercy and truth are met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed each other. What a beautiful picture that is, brethren and sisters. Mercy and truth. You see, sometimes when we look for truth as we understand truth, it's black and white. It's right and wrong. Well, that's not quite the way that truth in biblical terms is to be understood. Truth in biblical terms is more of light, of purity, of no shadow of turning, of no impurity, rather than, well, this is the way you've got to understand John chapter 1 verse 25. Whatever John 1:25 says, I don't know. But that's not truth that we're talking about, brothers and sisters. That's not God's truth. It's God's light. It's purity. And that purity, of course, will bring to light evil deeds, etc., etc. But it's tempered by mercy. So it's not a blinding light. It is light that is tempered by mercy, that understands that, yes, when things are examined in the light, there will be impurities. There will be issues. And that's why mercy is there alongside that. And then righteousness and peace, the expression is beautiful. They've kissed. They've come together. They're not separate things. They're not, sort of compartmentalised pieces. They have kissed. They have come in that expression of affection that we all recognise. And that's how our God is. It's not black and white. It's not level like that at all. It's actually bias towards mercy and peace and salvation. And a similar thought is there when we understand the term of scriptural equity. It's justice and fairness, but it's based on God's righteousness. And it's outcomes which are based on truth. Truth as in the light, rather than the modern concept of identical outcomes for all. Now, we need to understand that. That's what people understand equity today to be. Or that's inequitable, meaning it's not an equal outcome for me and for you. Well, that's not scriptural. Let's have a look at Psalm 89 there and see in verse 14 and see the importance of this concept. justice and judgment, which is justice and equity, the same as we have in Isaiah 5, are the habitation of thy throne. Mercy and truth shall go before thy face. So this is a core characteristic of our God. This idea of mercy and truth, compassion and judgment, righteousness and a fairness based on his righteousness. That's what he was looking for in the people in Isaiah 5. He didn't see it. So this, thanks Dan, this whole point of the parable, although it's applicable in its first application and initial application to the children of Israel, to the elders and the people of Israel in Isaiah's time, there is no question that the parable is saying you need to be, we need to be, our community has to have this fruit, which is the essential character of our God. It's not about how we ourselves are, in a sense. It is how we interact with each other. Are we showing the same characteristic that God shows to us? It's his throne. These are characteristics which are at the throne of God, in the very presence of God. And what he's saying is, that is the fruit that I'm expecting from my vineyard. I've done everything I could to put you in a fruitful place. Oh, do we feel like that? Yeah, if we apply this parable now to ourselves, and we can, because God hasn't changed, and we're going to see that Jesus takes this and applies it directly to ourselves as well as to the nation of Israel. How do we mirror that in our own community, brethren and sisters? How do we reflect God's justice as opposed to judgment? How do we reflect his mercy and his compassion? Because that's the fruit of the vineyard. Whether it's the nation of Israel, which it certainly is, the initial application here in Isaiah 5, is definitely the nation and how the people were as a community. But Jesus is going to take this and apply it to ourselves. So let's apply it now. Let's have a think about how we actually respond and react. And do we bring forth this sort of fruit? Now let's go to Matthew chapter 21. And we will see that in actual fact the same concept Christ picks up Isaiah chapter 5, and he has the same problem with the nation. Matthew 21, let's just get there. What's the intent? Well, the intent of the parable which he gives here of the husbandman and the labourers in the vineyard and the rejection of the teachers and ultimately the son is because what's the authority? By what authority did John and Jesus preach? Well, the parable was going to show that the owner of the vineyard actually had left, but he sent his son to look for the fruit. So that's, on a simple basis, a simple level, the intent. What's the context of the parable? Well, in verse 23, they challenged him. It'd be good if I was in chapter 21. They challenged him. And when he came in the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came unto him as he was teaching and said, By what authority dost thou do these things? And who gave you this authority? Now, he gives them an answer. It's just like Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 1, he gives them an answer. I'll ask you one thing. And he begins to, as it were, negotiate or teach with them and just speak to them. They don't accept it. But what he then does is give parables to illustrate the point. And when he gives the parable, at the end of the parable, the elders got the point. They didn't get the point when he was just dialogue. They got the point with the parable. And he gave a couple of parables. There's the parable of the two sons and a couple of others. But we're focusing on the vineyard because that was Isaiah chapter 5. So what was the application? Well, the initial application, quite clearly, what will the Lord of the vineyard do? That's the question that Jesus leaves with them. Well, he'd destroy the vineyard just like Isaiah chapter 5. But the question for us, and to think back to Isaiah 5, was there any justice or equity shown by the hired labourers? Did they bring forth the fruit that was actually going to be good grapes, sweet grapes, and not sour grapes? No, on no stretch of the imagination could one show that they showed justice and equity. What did they do? Well, first of all, they beat the ones, didn't they, that came to them? And then others they killed. And then finally the husbandman says, well, I'll send my son, surely they will revere him. They didn't, did they? They killed him. And it says at the end of that the elders perceived, verse 45, when the chief priests and the Pharisees had heard his parables, they perceived he spake of them. And the personal application? They wanted to lay hands on him and kill him. They wanted to do exactly what he said in the parable the labourers did. They didn't get the message. They just responded exactly to the picture which was painted in the parable. But they feared the multitude because they took him for a prophet. So there was that sort of balancing multitude there which stopped them actually putting into practice exactly what the Lord said was their intent. So there we have a build on Isaiah 5 here in Matthew 21, and the people hadn't changed, had they? God hadn't changed either. God was still looking for justice and equity. He was looking for fruit. He'd done everything that he possibly could to obtain good fruit. And it would seem here in this parable that Jesus said they actually had produced the physical fruit, but the people themselves were not reflecting what God was looking for. And once again, let's now take it out of their particular context, because there's no question it was right for them, because that's what the record says. The chief priests and scribes said, well, he's talking about us. Now, their response could have been, couldn't it? Maybe I better think about what I'm doing. But it wasn't. Okay, that's them. How about us? When someone challenges us, brothers and sisters, as to whether we are showing the principles of justice and equity in terms of how God shows righteousness and mercy and truth, how do we respond? Do we challenge it? Or do we stop and think, maybe I could do better? Maybe, there are things where I could put myself into the throne of God, as it were, at his feet, and learn the way that he would deal with my brothers and sisters, the way that he has dealt with us. as opposed to how these labourers dealt. So that's about all I wanted to do actually tonight, except to maybe introduce the next thought, which comes to with both the fig tree in the vineyard and the vine. And that's this. There's just a couple of things that is good to know about how they grew vines. They still do this today, actually. The first thing that's the most important thing is the soil preparation and maintenance. You know, we live in South Australia. We have a couple of great wine growing areas, 3, don't we? The Coonawarra, the Barossa, and down, where's down south? Oh yeah, they grow a few things, don't they? But, you know, yeah, that's still a work in progress. No. What do they focus on? I mean, what do they keep talking about with the Coonawarra particularly? They talk about, you know, how the red soil, the terra firma, it is ideal for producing. And the same with the Barossa in particular. I think McLaren's sort of a late entry. But the soil is absolutely critical. Absolutely critical. And I know this because a good friend of mine, a business associate, bought into a vineyard, and they spent it had been run down a bit, and he said that they anticipated spending 2 years doing nothing with the vines, just working with the soil to get the soil to the right sort of structure that could then support the vines with good fruit. And I know he knows what he's talking about because he's one of the producers that puts stuff into some very expensive wines. There's also 2 types of pruning. There's a winter prune, which we all see. You go through the Barossa and you see it, you know, they cut the branches right back, almost to the stump. There might just be 1 or 2 branches hanging out, right? But do you realise they actually cut back, not indiscriminately back to the stump or whatever. They actually cut back to where they can see that there's going to be buds, so that they know that when they cut back, they're not going to finish up with a dead little twig. They're actually going to, from there, have buds come. And so it's actually a way of determining what the potential crop is. And then in summertime, they move through the vines and they remove what's called the water spouts, the unproductive shoots. We got the same thing actually at home with our crepe myrtles. You know, they nice tree, a big flowering tree, and beautiful, you know, crepe myrtle flowers come. But down the base, at the base of the trunk, you get these little spouts come up, and they don't do anything except take juice from the big tree, and you've got to cut them off because they are taking sustenance and nutrients from the actual main tree. So that happens in summer, but you remove them so they're not going to, because they're not going to do anything. But what it also does in the vines is it improves the air circulation and the light, which gets to the branches which are producing the fruit. And by getting rid of those little spouts, you are actually going to get more concentration of the energy of the vine stock itself into the branches to produce good fruit. Now, all those things are going to come out in a sense when we look at the parable of the vine and also the fig in the vineyard. But it also illustrates the point which I made in the beginning, that you've got to be a little bit careful in balancing what is a picture and just a picture and what the parable might mean. Because you see, if I looked at that really carefully and thought about it in the context of John chapter 15, the vine, where the branches are removed and thrown on the heap if they don't produce fruit, or there is water spouts coming out, I could think that, well, if that's the disciples, who gets cut off and chucked out. Bit of a tricky question, isn't it? And it just illustrates, I think, if you think about it, that you've got to be careful in how literally you plough down into a parable and say, well, that must mean this, and how you also sit back and look at the general picture of what it's trying to say to us. And it may well be that this, although literally these water spouts are unproductive and they're removed and they have the benefit for the rest of the fruit, it's not necessarily talking about disciples, I wouldn't have thought. Maybe it's talking about stuff which we do which is unproductive. Anyway, we will explore that next time.